Hello again, everybody. I'm Eric Sperling. Thank you for joining the final episode of Season 1 of All in Education's Sepas series. I would like to welcome today's experts with us. We have Stephanie Parra back with us. She is the Executive Director of All in Education. Jeff Zetino is here on the stage, Director of Research and Policy with All in Education. And our special guest, Sharonda Bossier, CEO, Education Leaders of Color. You know, All in Education is a local nonprofit organization that exists to build an Arizona where all communities have access to opportunity and justice. Now, their work is focused on strengthening the Latino community by closing the representation gap to build power, influence, and authority across Arizona boardrooms and classrooms. During this season of the Sepas series, All in Education has been working to bridge their advocacy efforts to be inclusive of multiple factors outside of the classroom that are impacting the educational outcomes of students. They're calling these factors the social determinants of education. Now, the focus of Sepas is on having real, thought-provoking conversations with leaders and community members and identifying solutions to work towards creating meaningful changes in the systems meant to serve our communities. So today's conversation will mark the final episode of the season, and we will be discussing how each of these factors we talked about throughout the year are all intertwined. Now, to solve for one determinant, leaders in each sector need to collaborate and be bold enough to speak to how all of these factors impact the outcome for one another. Our panelists will speak on what these conversations look like and how we can all collaborate and bring forth long-term solutions. So before we do get in the conversation, I want to properly introduce Ms. Sharonda Bossier. Joining us all the way from Los Angeles, and the CEO of EdLoC, which is Education Leaders of Color. And Stephanie, you are a member of EdLoC, correct? So that's why we're going to have this fantastic discussion today. So Sharonda, before we get going, I do want you to have an opportunity to share a little bit more about your story and your why. Tell us a little about that.
Well, first, thanks for having me. So I'm Sharonda Bossier. I'm the CEO of EdLoC, or Education Leaders of Color. And I really started working in education because of my own life experiences. I grew up in the Watts section of Los Angeles, and my two high school options were a high school with a 60% graduation rate or a high school with a 40% graduation rate. And so I know what it's like to feel like even the best option in your community isn't a great one. And I also know what it's like to have educators see your potential and invest in that potential. I entered high school a pretty angry kid, a kid that got into fights, that caused a lot of trouble, and my teachers saw past that, and they helped me figure out ways that I could channel the anger I was experiencing about what was happening in my community and what was happening in my family, and really sort of helped me see a pathway towards advocacy and activism that fundamentally changed my outlook, my life, my trajectory, and the trajectory of the 7 siblings coming behind me. I went on to college, proud banana sled, UC Santa Cruz graduate, and really went to college thinking I was going to become a lawyer. I'd fallen in love with Felicia Rashad's character, Claire Huxtable, on The Cosby Show. I had very few professional role models who were Black women, and so I really latched on to that example. But my second year of undergrad, I got a job as a writing tutor, and it was at the encouragement of one of my writing professors, and I realized really quickly that all of the kids who were coming into the writing center for academic support and intervention were my friends. They were the Black and Latino kids who had done the right things, who had followed the rules, who had made it into the UC system, but potentially were not going to make it out. And that, for me, raised a whole new set of questions about my role in doing what was needed for folks who came from where I came from. So I stayed an extra year, got a master's degree in education, started teaching. My first teaching experience was actually teaching the children of migrant farm workers on the Central Coast, which opened my eyes to a whole set of other issues that families were confronting as they were pursuing a better life and hoping that their kids would have a better life after having come to this country. And so I spent 5 years in the classroom, never really feeling like we were doing right by low-income families, wanting to figure out what I could do to push for systems change. Started a parent advocacy organization when I was living in New York, and worked with low-income families on navigating the system there. And through that work, got a chance to meet leaders all across the country who were grappling with the same issues, who were finding themselves feeling isolated in their roles, who wanted to talk about how broader social and economic justice issues intersected with education, and who were looking for a community of support. And so had the privilege 6 years ago to help launch EdLoC. We're now almost 1,000 members across the country, which is very wild and exciting to say. But part of what always brings me back to my why is asking myself if I'm making 17-year-old Sharonda proud. Am I asking the tough questions? Am I thinking about all of the ways in which I was vulnerable, all of the ways in which people saw me and saw my potential on the other side of what was immediately visible to them, and thinking about what it means to carry forth a legacy of service and justice that my grandparents, my educators, and honestly, my priests instilled in me growing up. So that is my why. I'm trying to make 17-year-old Sharonda proud.
Well, thank you for sharing that story, and I'm excited to have you as part of this conversation. And Stephanie, before I bring you in, let's bring up the social determinants of education graphic that we have, because it does paint a clear picture of what we're talking about. So Stephanie, can you share, your thoughts on the how and the why All in Education decided to call out all of these important factors, and more importantly, center, on a large portion of your work on them?
Yeah. Sure. So I think Sharonda's story was a perfect setup for our why it was important for us to bring the social determinants of education to the forefront. Because we know as educators and practitioners in the field that there are factors outside of the classroom that impact a child's attainment. And we firmly believe at All in Education that we're not going to close the attainment gaps that exist until we actually solve for the larger systemic challenges facing our communities. Issues like poverty, healthcare, lack of access to healthcare and mental health, the school to prison pipeline, housing, food insecurity, immigration, the environment, and then of course access to jobs in the economy. So that is why we named each factor. Sharonda's story is unique, but it's not different from a lot of our stories. A lot of us come to this work, leaders in our network here of Adelante Fellows and Listo leaders have very similar stories of why we come to this work and why we are so passionate, why we want justice in the education system, because we know what we experienced, we know what our siblings experienced, our cousins, our nieces, our nephews. Kids growing up in Arizona's public education system deserve leaders who are willing to push against the status quo and actually build long-term sustainable solutions for them.
Jeff, we're going to ask you a little bit about data in a moment, but just, we've been going around the room talking about our whys, and when you see that graphic, you see those 9 social determinants, what goes through your mind? What about your why?
Well, my why is definitely, to kind of echo what Sharonda was saying, having that survivor's guilt, kind of making it to college and then looking back. I remember writing my personal narrative, the part of the application to get into college, and a lot of what I talked about was a lot of my friends being a lot more talented than I was, a lot more smarter than I was, a lot more outgoing than I was, and they were the ones being left behind. And for me, part of my story was a college counselor that took me under his wing and told me what FAFSA was, and basically got me into school. But I think what you were saying, Stephanie, is that we all share kind of like this innate understanding, this feeling of living and coming from our neighborhoods, but we just didn't have that language to talk about the social determinants of education, or the language to kind of really articulate our experiences to the broader community. So that's kind of why we're using this framework to give an insight into all of the different layered challenges that we experience day in and day out.
All right, so let's talk more about some of those challenges. And Sharonda, as a leader of an organization that's focused on outcomes, and let's key in there on outcomes for students. How is your work tied to those social determinants of education we just showed on screen?
Yeah, so when we launched 6 years ago, our North Star was always about helping young people break cycles of generational poverty in their families and in their communities. And we thought that was pretty clear, because for most of us, we got into education because we felt like it provided us with the shortest and surest pathway out of poverty, and we thought the same could be true for so many other young people. I think the past couple of years really highlighted for us the need to be more explicit about why we were going beyond education. to name some of those systemic barriers that young people encounter, and to talk about the importance of educators chiming in on those conversations and working in collaboration and coalition with other leaders who are working on those same issues. And so when we took a step back to about a year and a half ago and said, like, who do we need to be in this moment to best support our leaders who are serving young people who are experiencing right now a pretty acute crisis, but it's not a new one. It meant for us naming explicitly that our young people didn't have access to health care, that their parents didn't either. It meant talking about the student debt burden that disproportionately impacts low-income first-generation students of color, right, which makes it harder for them to then become homeowners, right, which then makes it harder for them to build wealth and then invest in their children's futures, et cetera. So we tried to do a better job in the past sort of year and a half of making clear that for us, educators cannot solve the education crisis in a silo, that it is important that we are seen as collaborators with folks who are working on housing issues, immigration issues, criminal justice reform issues, because all of those issues are issues that impact the young people we serve. And a kid cannot focus on science if they are hungry. They cannot focus on math if they don't know where they're going to sleep that night. They cannot focus on their literature lesson if they don't feel safe. And so those are the kinds of things that we're saying, like, there are a set of preconditions that must exist in communities for young people to thrive. Educators are a part of the puzzle. We can't do it alone, and neither can anyone else who is working to ensure that young people are successful and thriving.
I like what you said there. You said this is an acute crisis, but it's not a new crisis. And so are you finding it challenging, or is it something where you're building momentum of this holistic approach for solutions, not just one problem needs to be solved? Again, taking it on from the entire social determinants.
What's been really interesting is that the folks who are doing the work get it and welcome the input and additional capacity of educators. Where we have the hardest work to do, I think, are with the folks who are funding lots of education nonprofits. They want us to focus only on student test scores or graduation rates or student retention rates, and it's been much harder than I anticipated, maybe I was just naive, to make the case for why educators should be talking about those social determinants, to make the case for why we should be dedicating real resources and capacity to that work. That's been the hardest sell.
Okay, Jeff, data time. Let's talk about your work and maybe some of the different things that you've discovered in your work, especially over the last year, when it comes to the correlation between education outcomes and those social determinants.
Right. I was just thinking about Sharonda's experience about how a lot of things changed because of the pandemic. And I think that was part of our experience as well. As we started writing our first MAPA, it was in response to the impact that we foresaw within our communities, because we understood that a lot of our communities were already at risk, and we could tell that the pandemic was going to hit our students hard and the hardest. And unfortunately, through the data, we have seen that came to fruition. So a part of my story in graduating college, I came to Phoenix, master's in social work. You know, all the energy in the world. I wanted to go out and kind of provide services. But providing services never really connected to the experience that I saw my mom go through, or my parents go through, or my sisters go through, right? Immigrant mom, working 2 jobs, coming home, trying to be the mom, the dad, the breadwinner, the educator, right? Having to buy a gallon of milk at basically twice the price because we had to go to a liquor store and not the grocery store because we didn't have access to it. Or spotty healthcare, or every day or every end of the month, you know, stress and anxiety going through the roof because we didn't know how we were going to make ends meet. So how do you find that experience in the data? As I was working in public health, we came across the idea of the social determinants of health. And that was a great framework to start thinking about the root causes to a lot of issues that were happening in healthcare. But I think when we start thinking about it in the education system or in the education sector, one of my mentors started talking about we can't keep thinking about these issues binary. Like it's funding or it's the curriculum or it's the teacher. We have to understand the conditions of the neighborhood and the community. And that's when we kind of latched onto this whole social determinants of education. The data is matching what we thought we were going to see when it came down to housing, when it came down to safety, to immigration issues, the school to prison pipeline, environmental concerns. The only thing that's been surprising is that it hasn't been collected into one piece where we're able to say all of these different sectors and issues are impacting our students.
Okay, I want to let our streaming audience know we do have a live audience here of educators and different leaders in our community. So Stephanie, I know the question I'm going to ask you will probably resonate well with this live studio audience. You know, you're so connected with the community and different leaders when it comes to the education space. What are some of the challenges you're hearing? Are they similar to what Jeff is saying, what Sharonda is saying? And maybe what are some of those challenges that have been overlooked?
Yeah, I think similarly, this idea, and I shared as we were getting ready for the show, like just 2 years ago, when I started talking about like the impacts of poverty on the community in real time, that's what we were hearing on the ground in 2020, that families were already feeling food insecure, they were already worried about housing and shelter issues. And I was told to stay in my lane, right? My lane is education. And I think that's at the core, the problem, that we have operated in the advocacy world in our silos, and that we continue to tell folks like, no, if you're in housing, you stay in housing. If you're in education, you stay in education, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality is that families experience challenges layered and stacked on top of each other. And so to Sharonda's point, a child cannot be ready for teaching and learning at 8 a.m. on a Monday morning if they are hungry and they haven't eaten since their last meal at school last Friday, right? So that is real. That is a very real condition that's happening in our communities right now. And so we have to be honest about how children are experiencing challenges, how families are experiencing challenges, and how we as the adults in education come together to build cross-sector collaborations that will actually create the systemic change that communities need. Because until we do that, the challenges are going to continue to mount and stack on top of children and families.
And Jeff, you know, you work with data a lot, but really what Stephanie's talking about too is changing the language, right? So that, you know, when somebody does say, stay in your lane, you have language to say, no, it's important, why we can't and why we need to communicate. So how can we be more effective at what Stephanie was talking about, busting those silos and having more cross-sector collaboration? Again, I'm looking at a room full of education leaders. How do we get other leaders in other spaces to be a part of these conversations?
I think one of the main things is respect, right? I think now that we're talking about the social determinants of education, there's a lot of different, not only community sectors, but pieces of our community that are going to start to engage in this work. So for example, now parents are implicated. So parents and grassroots organizing. Grassroots organizing has a different lens and a different language on how we engage in the work. Now we have coalitions and alliances and collective impact efforts. And there's a different language and culture on how they engage into the work. And then we have school systems. We have teachers, administrators, school boards, and their way of handling and addressing systemic change. So I think we all have to respect one another's perspective on how we enter the work. But once we all enter the work, I think we need to develop a common language around what are the indicators and metrics that we're going to begin to look at, right? Mm-hmm. What are the indicators and metrics that pop up in housing, that pop up in education, that pop up in the ER or in hospital medical care? For example, one of the things that we're looking at right now is chronic absenteeism. Mm-hmm. On the surface level, it's easy for us to judge a parent and say, why aren't you getting your kid to school? But once we begin to understand parents and students and what they're going through, we start to unveil the social determinants of education or the root cause issues to what's happening within our community. So developing that common language, but lastly, and I think most importantly, is how do we identify and uplift the leadership within our communities, our parents, students, and our community. This is gonna have to be a sustained movement if we're gonna make a dent into these issues. But I think it starts with that respect, common language, and uplifting our community's voices.
Sharonda, I'd love to get your feedback on this answer.
Yeah.
Again, the language, and you're seeing this too from a national perspective, and I'm sure you're hearing a lot of different leaders across the country present some of those same challenges, and maybe you can expand a little more on what those challenges have been, but maybe also where the success has been.
Yeah, I think luckily I get to see lots of successes from my seat. And so through some of our grant making work, we try and invest in leaders who are working at the intersection of education and some broader justice issues. So All in Education is a good example of that, right? Also here in Phoenix, Aliento, who I know lots of folks in the room know, right? Reina Montoya is also an EdLoC member and has been a leading voice actually on immigration reform and DACA and the need to provide young people with a pathway towards citizenship and towards full participation in our society. We also get to work with leaders across the country who are working at the intersection of education and housing, right? Thinking about what it means to build stable communities and trying to track the impact of access to stable and affordable housing on student mobility rates, right? Thinking about what it means to build denser communities so that if we're thinking about chronic absenteeism, a big hurdle is transportation in most cities, right? And so we are trying to the extent that we can, invest in leaders who are leading organizations and initiatives that we think can be proof points, elevate them to policymakers and to funders who have far more resources to support those ideas, to scale those initiatives, in the hopes that folks will start to look to our members as leaders in trying to tackle these issues.
So Stephanie, let's talk about what's next. We've had a great discussion here on the work currently going on, but how do you see All in Education? How do you see your work evolving in our community?
Yeah, I think we continue to develop this conversation, but I think for us at All in Education, and we usually close out our episodes with a call to action, right? It's time to move towards action. So how are we now taking the work from discussion to real-time action? How do we test some of our models, test some of our theories, pilot some projects, and then really start to build the proof points about what's possible when you invest differently in housing and in transportation. Will we see the outcomes that we need to reduce chronic absenteeism rates and increase achievement rates? Like, we need to start to build those coalitions of educators and practitioners in our field with that cross-sector community collaborative that we want to build towards. So I think that that's what's on the horizon. I also think that we need to really unpack the data and start to determine what is the root cause of what is that key indicator of the 9 social determinants that we've identified this year. What is the key indicator that is impacting attainment? And so, little teaser, we'll start to unveil some of that at our MAPA Summit in January, so invite folks to join us for MAPA.
And let's put that graphic on the screen while we have it, the social determinants of education one more time.
Yes, perfect, yeah. So of those social determinants, we'll start to unpack through MAPA what it is that is really impacting attainment, the data that we were able to collect, and then also what are the gaps in the data, right? What do we need to start monitoring, and how do we come together, whether it's in the education sector or housing or healthcare, et cetera? How do we start to share data with each other to make better informed decisions on behalf of kids and families?
And as we look at this graphic here, is there, and we're talking about action and things that require action, and I don't know if I'm giving anything away, but is there one of these that surfaces kind of above the other that needs more attention? I mean, they're all important, but is there one that sticks out?
And we know this to be true. It's not going to be a shocker to anybody in the room, but we've been saying as educators for a really long time that poverty is the greatest barrier to educational attainment. And the data so far is proving that to be true. So in our MAPA report, we'll start to unpack a little bit more about how it's showing up in the data. So that is definitely one.
Sharhonda, does that surprise you at all or anything?
It resonates with my experience. It resonates with just about every study we've, that has come out tackling these issues. And I think given where our members are focused, it makes sense. I think people understand that if young people are not safe, secure, and cared for, they cannot learn.
And we just talked about All in Education's kind of vision moving forward. What about your organization, your vision moving forward? How, as an organization, you can rally leaders on a national level. What's next for your organization?
So similar to Stephanie, we are always trying to figure out how we move people to action. So we are doing more work to ensure our educators are chiming in on issues related to child welfare, to family well-being. If we just issued a call to action today, for those of you who didn't see it, around the child tax credit because of the impact that that had on the child poverty rate in this country, and working again to secure more resources so that we're able to support leaders who we think should be leading the work in changing life outcomes for young people.
We're going to wrap things up here, but just a couple of final questions, and this may be a difficult one here. What are the implications, local level-wise, community-wise, state-wise, nationally, if we fail to act on what we were talking about here today?
Yeah, I think all of the fear mongering in the press around crime rates, around disengaged young people, around people who are trapped in cycles of hopelessness and desperation across the country actually become true. I think when you have very limited options, you know, and we see this, right? And the data tells us this too, right? We've been talking about deaths of desperation in our country. When people are disengaged, when they are disconnected, when there is not a community holding them together, wrapping their arms around them, all of us are impacted by that.
Jeff?
Yeah, you brought up deaths of desperation, and that is a really interesting indicator because it starts to move out of communities, BIPOC communities or underserved communities, and starts to move into the middle class white community. So that's kind of some of the work that we did in our first MAPA, is looking at expanding lower class or expanding rates of poverty and more people falling into poverty. We're seeing a shrinking middle class, and we're seeing a lot of wealth being accumulated in the hands of a very small proportion of people. So we think that education is the last bastion of defense against what this might become a really negative, ugly, dystopian future, right? I think education becomes our way of being able to deliver on the promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
That's Stephanie, two-part final question for you. I'm going to have you, what if we don't act? And then also kind of a wrap up on this discussion as a whole. We've heard some incredible perspective from both our guests today, and love to hear your thoughts on what they had to say and moving forward. But first, if we don't act, what's going to happen?
I'm going to go back to the data point that I think started social determinants with. So as a school board member in the Phoenix Union High School District, our demographics are 10 years ahead of the city of Phoenix and 20 years ahead of the state of Arizona. And Arizona has historically trended 20 years ahead of the country. We are 90% students of color. We are 82% Latino. And unfortunately, right now, about almost 80% of our students qualify for free and reduced price lunch. So that is the future. In real time, that is data, that is not made up. That is the future. If we do not change outcomes for the kids in the urban core of Phoenix, we are going to have a city of Phoenix that is adults who are majority low income, and a future state economy that is majority low income. And so every time I talk to a business leader, they have that look on their face.
Those numbers resonate.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard, like you said, you can't ignore that data.
We can't ignore the data, and we can't pretend like this community is not here, like we do not exist. It is historically, our community has been viewed in Arizona, the demographics have been viewed as a problem that needs to be solved rather than an asset that's worthy of investment. And so we at All in Education are here to say that our community is an incredible asset. We are diverse, we are resilient, we are bilingual, we are bicultural, and we deserve investment just like any other community. And so that, to me, is how we change the trajectory so that we avoid that future.
Well, you just said, some stuff that was very eye-opening. In fact, this whole year has been eye-opening, to say the least. Every month through each episode, no doubt myself, others have been able to gain more knowledge and really understand how critical it is to work together to identify these long-term solutions. And Stephanie, you mentioned off the top, but I know we want to thank the Garcia Family Foundation again for all their efforts contributing to this series.
Absolutely. We can't do this work alone. We appreciate the support of our partners. For this series, it has been the Garcia Family Foundation who has invested in our work and helped us to continue to bring Sepas to the community.
And while today does mark the final episode of this season, it does not mean the show is over. A very brand new season of Sepas will begin airing monthly starting in March of 2023. So to make sure to mark your calendar, stay tuned to find out what is next for PACE Sepas and the social determinants of education. I want to thank you guys so much for such a great discussion, great perspective, and Stephanie and Jeff just all year long, putting these together. I know Anais is in the room for all her hard work, the entire team at All in Education. Sharonda, thank you for visiting from LA. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. We'll see you next year.